For 70 years, the United States sailed through Canada's Arctic as if it already owned it. No permission, no apologies, no consequences. And Canada let it happen, not because it agreed, but because it couldn't stop it. Now, here's the moment Washington didn't expect. Canada just spent $7 billion to change one brutal fact of geopolitics. Sovereignty isn't what you declare, it's what you can physically enforce. When Mark Carney announced new Arctic icebreakers, he wasn't funding ships, he was ending an era where American submarines surfaced in Canadian waters and called them international, an era where U.S. vessels ignored Ottawa because Ottawa had no way to answer back. Donald Trump thought economic pressure would break Canada. Instead, he triggered the most aggressive Arctic power shift in modern North American history. If you want to understand how climate collapse became a strategic weapon and why the Northwest Passage just turned into a $900 billion battlefield, stay with me. Because to understand what's happening now, you first have to understand why Canada lost control in the first place. The story isn't really about ice or ships or even climate change. It's about how power actually works when legal arguments collide with physical reality. For decades, Canada said the Northwest Passage was sovereign territory. The United States said it wasn't. And nothing happened because nothing could happen. Washington didn't need to win the legal debate. It only needed to pass through uncontested, and it did, again and again. That's the quiet rule of geopolitics most people miss. Law follows power, not the other way around. When a country can't monitor its territory, can't service vessels, can't enforce regulations, its sovereignty becomes theoretical, even if every map says otherwise. The Arctic was the perfect example. Frozen, remote, inaccessible, a dispute that didn't matter until suddenly it mattered more than anything. Because once the ice began to disappear, the argument stopped being academic. It became economic, strategic, existential. And that's where everything starts to change. To see why Canada was powerless for so long, we have to go back not to politics, but to geography and history. For most of modern history, the Northwest Passage was more legend than reality. Maps promised a shortcut between the Atlantic and the Pacific. The Arctic delivered death, wreckage, and frozen steel. Ships were crushed by ice, crews vanished. The route existed in theory, not in practice. That single fact shaped everything that followed. Because when a territory can't be used, it doesn't need to be defended. Canada claimed the Arctic archipelago after World War II, but there was no urgency to control it. No ports, no roads, no permanent military presence. And so when American vessels passed through, Ottawa protested politely and then stood aside, not out of weakness, out of impossibility. The ice made enforcement irrelevant. 10 months of frozen darkness did what armies could not. It froze the dispute itself. But climate change shattered that equilibrium. As Arctic ice began retreating faster than any strategic planner expected, the Northwest Passage stopped being a frozen myth. It became a route, then a corridor, then a future economy waiting to be claimed. And once the ice began to disappear, every unresolved argument rushed back to the surface at once. Which brings us to the first moment when that tension finally exploded. The first real shock didn't come from China. It didn't come from Russia. It came from the United States itself. In 1969, an American oil tanker sailed straight through the Northwest Passage. No permission requested, no approval granted. Just steel moving through Canadian waters as if Ottawa didn't exist. Canada protested. Washington ignored it. 16 years later, it happened again. An American icebreaker cut through the Arctic in 1985, repeating the same message with even more clarity. These waters were not Canada's to control. Ottawa was furious and helpless. They sent icebreakers to escort the ships, not to stop them. They issued statements, not orders. And in 1988, Canada and the United States signed what was politely called cooperation and quietly understood as surrender. America agreed to notify Canada before transiting Canada agreed not to enforce anything. That was the crisis beneath the surface. Not a confrontation, a demonstration. For Washington, it proved the passage was international. For Canada, it proved something far worse. Sovereignty without enforcement is just a story other countries don't have to believe. And once that lesson was learned, it didn't stay confined to the Arctic. Because while Canada hesitated, others were paying very close attention. What really mattered here wasn't law, it was capacity. International rules only work when someone has the means to enforce them. Without ports, without icebreakers, without year-round surveillance, Canada couldn't regulate traffic, inspect vessels, or deny access, even if the law was on its side. That's why the United States never felt pressure to compromise. It didn't need to. Transit without resistance creates its own reality. And this is where the system becomes brutally simple. Ships follow incentives, not legal theory. If a country can't offer refueling, repairs, pilots, or safe passage, vessels have no reason to acknowledge its authority. If it can't monitor who enters and exits, it can't control behavior. If it can't impose costs for noncompliance, sovereignty evaporates. For decades, the Arctic's hostility disguised this weakness. ICE enforced Canada's claims better than any institution ever could. But as the ice retreated, the system flipped. What had been a frozen shield became an open door. And open doors don't stay neutral for long, because once the passage became navigable, the question stopped being, who is right? It became, who is ready? And Canada wasn't until pressure from the South forced a choice it had been postponing for generations. The second rupture didn't arrive through the Arctic. It came through trade. When Donald Trump began threatening Canada economically, tariffs, retaliation, public talk of annexation, Ottawa finally understood something it had avoided for decades. Dependence is vulnerability. For years, Arctic policy had been ceremonial. Speeches, white papers, deferred investments. Then the pressure became real. Suddenly, access to American markets was no longer guaranteed. Suddenly, alternative trade routes weren't optional, they were survival. And suddenly, a frozen corridor in the far north looked less like an abstract future and more like an escape hatch. That's when the Arctic stopped being symbolic. Mark Carney didn't treat Trump's threats as temporary noise. He treated them as structural risk, and instead of negotiating harder, he shifted the terrain entirely. The response wasn't diplomatic, it was material. Ports, icebreakers, military infrastructure, not promises, commitments. Trump expected submission. What he triggered instead was strategic acceleration. Because once a country starts building the physical capacity to enforce sovereignty, it doesn't need permission anymore. And that decision changed who benefits and who loses from the opening of the Arctic. Which brings us to the people who live with the consequences first. If you live thousands of kilometers south, the Arctic can feel abstract. A map, a headline, someone else's problem. But if you live in the north, this shift changes everything. For decades, communities were isolated not by choice, but by geography. Supplies arrived late, jobs left early. Young people moved south because there was nothing to stay for. Now imagine what it means when ships arrive regularly, when ports create work, when roads connect towns that used to be cut off by ice and darkness. This isn't just about trade routes. It's about whether people can build a future where they already live. And this is where the argument over sovereignty stops being legal and becomes personal. Because when a country finally invests in the infrastructure that supports its own citizens, control stops being theoretical. You don't feel sovereignty in courtrooms. You feel it in employment, stability, and dignity. If this kind of analysis helps you see power differently, not as slogans, but as systems, take a second to stay connected. Because what happens next doesn't stop at Canada's borders. Once a nation reshapes its Arctic, the ripple effects reach far beyond the people who live there. Once the Arctic becomes usable, it stops being regional. It becomes global. A navigable Northwest Passage doesn't just shorten shipping routes. It rearranges power. Every ship that saves thousands of kilometers reshapes supply chains. Every port that offers fuel and repairs shifts where money flows. And every country that controls access to those routes gains leverage that didn't exist before. This is why Russia invested early. This is why China declared itself a near-Arctic state. And this is why Canada's move changes the strategic map. If the passage is treated as international, any nation can claim transit rights. That includes countries North America doesn't want operating freely near its northern flank. But if Canada enforces control, something very different happens. Access becomes conditional. Rules matter. Monitoring returns. This puts Washington in an uncomfortable position. Opposing Canadian sovereignty may protect freedom of navigation in theory, but it weakens continental security in practice. And inside NATO, the tension deepens. Allies agree on defending the Arctic. They don't agree on who gets to decide the rules. That unresolved contradiction doesn't stay neutral for long. It creates space, and in geopolitics, space is always filled by someone. Which leaves one final question. Where does this path lead if Canada keeps going? From here, the Arctic future splits into three paths. The best-case scenario is quiet but transformative. Canada completes its infrastructure. Icebreakers patrol year-round. Ports function. Rules are enforced. The legal dispute never fully disappears, but it stops mattering. Other nations comply because it's easier and safer to do so. North American security improves. Trade flows stabilize. The Arctic becomes governed, not contested. The middle path is messier. Canada builds capacity, but enforcement remains selective. Allies cooperate unofficially. Washington maintains its legal objections while avoiding confrontation. The passage functions, but under constant tension. It works, but it's fragile. The worst-case scenario is the one no one wants to say out loud. The United States keeps insisting the passage is international. China and Russia use that precedent aggressively. Transit becomes crowded. Monitoring fails. Deterrence érode. In that world, the Arctic becomes a corridor of uncertainty, exactly where great power competition is most dangerous. What determines which path we take isn't ideology. It's investment, presence, and the willingness to accept that power, once ceded, is rarely reclaimed without consequence. Which brings us to the final question and the final reckoning. What this story ultimately reveals isn't a Canadian victory or an American defeat. It's something more unsettling. Power doesn't disappear when it's challenged. It relocates. Donald Trump believed leverage came from size, bigger markets, louder threats, harsher pressure. What he missed is that pressure doesn't always produce compliance. Sometimes it produces adaptation. Canada didn't win an argument. It changed the environment in which the argument mattered. By building ports instead of filing protests, by launching icebreakers instead of issuing statements, Canada transformed sovereignty from a legal claim into a lived reality. And once that happens, law follows slowly, reluctantly, but inevitably. This is the lesson. Washington didn't want to teach the world that American pressure can be resisted, that allies have options, that control isn't granted, it's constructed. The Arctic is opening, not just to ships, but to a new logic of power. And if you think this ends at Canada's northern waters, you're missing the pattern. Because the same dynamic is quietly unfolding elsewhere, wherever infrastructure replaces rhetoric. If you want to understand where the next fault lines will appear, stay with me. Because this wasn't the end of the story. It was the proof of concept. And the world is watching who learns from it next.